Welcome back to Weathering the Storm, a podcast where we strive to weather the storms of life by placing and sustaining an unwavering faith in God. I'm your host, Drew Suttles. We are in episode 6 of season 11 of Weathering the Storm, and it has certainly been a beneficial study for me. I've really been challenged by this, and I've looked forward to preparing these episodes, and I hope and pray that it's been helpful for you, certainly and specifically in weathering the storm of information overload, which is our theme this season. We want to thank you so much for listening to us here at the Scattered Abroad Network. I'm grateful that this podcast is a part of that work, and I'm grateful that Scattered Abroad is a work of the Memphis School of Preaching. And thankful for the teachers, the instructors that I had there, the classmates, of course, the instruction that I received. And if there's anyone listening here who's thinking about preaching the gospel, may I encourage you to look into the Memphis School of Preaching and to go there. 2 of the best years of my life, and grateful for the time that I got to spend, and once again, all the instruction that I received, the way that I was challenged. And I appreciate so much the rigor that was there, but also the compassion that our instructors had on us in preparing us for preaching the gospel. Today, as we continue our study of weathering the storm of information overload, we're going to go back to the Old Testament, to 1 Kings chapter 12. Last week, if you listened in, we went to 1 Kings 22, we talked about Ahab and how he didn't want to listen to Micaiah. He had his mind made up of what he wanted to hear, and so he listened to the 400 prophets instead of listening to what God had to say. And what we have a few chapters earlier is very similar, and that's with Rehoboam when he listens to the bad counsel instead of listening to wise counsel. So we're in 1 Kings chapter 12. We're going to focus on verses 1 through 16. And we want to make this point as we begin, and that is this. Leaders, every leader has a feed. Nobody leads alone. Every decision you make as a leader is shaped by voices, whether that's advisors, peers, different sources, maybe it's assumptions that you may have. And when I was preparing for this episode today, I kept thinking about baseball. As you're listening to this, we're into our season because the season will start up in February and we'll go on through, hopefully, at the end of a dog pile in May, winning a state championship. That's of course, our goal. But when I think about leading the baseball program, a high school baseball program, I certainly cannot and do not try to do it by myself. I need help. I need voices. And I have a lot of experience on my coaching staff, not even just with high school, but even middle school. And I look up to those men. And I'm the youngest one on the staff. And so I have a lot of respect for the wisdom that I can, go to with the guys on the staff. I have my assistant coach was a head coach for many years in Ohio and then here locally in South Georgia. So being able to turn to him and say, hey, what would you do in this situation? Sometimes it's a simple thing. I've got a pitcher who's pitching. He might say, hey, remember, we play this team next week, so maybe we don't show them this guy today. Maybe we save them for him. Or, hey, this guy has pitched. He's only got so many pitches left. Maybe we should go ahead and pull him. We're ahead by these many runs. Just having that voice helps me to make decisions because at the end of the day, if it goes good or if it falls apart, it's on me. I've got to make sure that I'm making the right decisions. And sometimes I make the wrong ones, but I certainly want to listen to those around me. But sometimes leaders will choose affirmation over wisdom, and people pay the price. So going back to a baseball analogy, let's say that in my mind, I'm a former pitcher. My mentality was, I'm going to stay in here and I'm going to get us out of this jam. I'm going to pump the zone. I'm going to throw strikes. I'm going to get us out. But the reality is some days you just don't have it. I remember my first game coaching. I had a guy that was pitching and he just didn't have it that day and he kept walking batters. Just over and over and over again. And one of my assistant coaches said, you might want to go ahead and pull him. And I said, no, I want to teach him a lesson. I want him to learn that I'm not just going to go pull him and give him an easy out. I want him to bear down and hopefully build some confidence for the next outing. Well, that didn't go well because he walked in 9 runs before I made a pitching change. And so I learned a very important lesson that day. I need to listen to the wisdom around me. In my mind, I'm thinking, oh, I'm going to teach him a lesson. But you know what happened? The team paid the price for that. We got beat. We came back, but those 9 runs in the first inning were insurmountable for us to overcome. And I want you to think about that illustration as we dive into this study today from 1 Kings chapter 12, that Rehoboam, he didn't have social media, but he did have a peer group that sounded like him. And one bad listening decision fractured a nation. So as we go into the text, 1 Kings chapter 12, we want to first notice that there was a leadership moment that required wisdom. 1 Kings chapter 12, verses 1 through 5. The Bible says, Rehoboam went to Shechem, for all Israel had gone to Shechem to make him king. It happened when Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, heard it. He was still in Egypt. He had fled from the presence of King Solomon, had been dwelling in Egypt, that they sent and they called him. And Jeroboam and the whole assembly of Israel came and spoke to Jeroboam, saying, Your father made our yoke heavy. Now therefore lighten the burdensome service of your father, and his heavy yoke which he put on us, and we will serve you. So he said to them, Depart for 3 days, then come back to me. And the people departed. A few things about this that we want to bring out. Number one, we learn that Solomon is dead, and Rehoboam takes the throne. And so now they're looking to him as the leader. And so the people come to him with a request. They say, Lighten the heavy yoke your father put on us. This is not rebellion, it's negotiation. And Rehoboam, as we begin, he actually does something pretty smart, pretty wise. He says, You go away for 3 days and then come again. In other words, let me have some time to think. Wise leaders don't rush decisions. And my dad always said, if there's a decision that you need to make that's going to impact your family, it's going to impact your health, it's going to impact your wallet, he said, give it 10 days before you make a decision. Sleep on it, think about it, and that was just his rule of thumb. I'm going to give it 10 days before I give you an answer. So pause matters. Taking time matters. Don't make a decision hastily because it can have a long-lasting effect that's very negative. So again, wise leaders don't rush decisions. But we need to make this point too. Wisdom isn't just about time. It's about who you consult. Who are you listening to? As we continue in the text, we want to notice now the voice of experience. Unfortunately, this is the counsel that he ignored. In verse 6 it says, Then King Rehoboam consulted the elders who stood before his father Solomon while he still lived, and he said, How do you advise me to answer these people? And they spoke to him, saying, If you will be a servant to these people today, and serve them, and answer them, and speak good words to them, then they will be your servants forever. So here he consults the elders who serve Solomon. It's a good decision. And their advice was, if you'll be a servant to this people, then they will be your servants forever. And so they're promoting humility. They're promoting, being a king that listens to the people, a king that's leading by example, service-based leadership, if you will. But you know what this counsel would do? It would cost Rehoboam his ego. It would cost him his control. It would cost him his pride, and so he rejects it. He ignores the counsel of the voices of those who had experience and wisdom. And here's the sad truth. We often dismiss wisdom not because it's unclear, but because it's inconvenient. It doesn't line up with what we thought it was going to be. We don't want to hear it. And even though we do hear it and it's clear as a bell, it's not convenient. It doesn't line up with what we thought it should be, and so we dismiss it. That's what he did. He ignored the voice of experience. But that brings us to the next point. Unfortunately, the counsel he does prefer is not the voice of experience, but the voice of his peers. Look at verses 8 through 11. It says, He rejected the advice which the elders had given him, and he consulted the young men who had grown up with him, who stood before him. He said to them, "What advice do you give? How should we answer this people who have spoken to me, saying, 'Lighten the yoke which your father put on us'?" The young men who had grown up with him spoke to him, saying, "Thus you should speak to this people who have spoken to you, saying, 'Your father made our yoke heavy, but you make it lighter on us.' Thus you shall say to them, 'My little finger shall be thicker than my father's waist.' And now, whereas my father put a heavy yoke on you, I will add to your yoke. My father chastised you with whips, I'll chastise you with scourges." I mean, you're talking about two completely different sounding boards. One says, be a servant, listen to the people, be compassionate. The other says, you need to be harsher, you need to be louder, you need to be more dominant than Solomon. This is insecurity masked as strength. This is cruelty framed as authority. This is listening to people your age, to people that, well, here's what I would do if I was in your position, instead of listening to people who had more wisdom, who had more experience. So he ignored the good wisdom, the good counsel, and he preferred and listened to the voice of his peers. Why did Rehoboam choose to listen to them? Well, maybe it's because they shared his background. Maybe it's because they shared his fears. Maybe it's because they affirmed his instincts. But today we have to understand something. Peer voices often feel trustworthy because they sound like us. You know, maybe you think about, for example, I go back to baseball. You know, maybe I call one of my former teammates and say, "Hey, you know, I'm thinking about doing this with the lineup today. Thinking about doing this with this particular player. I'm going to move him from, I don't know, third base to left field and just see if it helps us defensively." And he might say, because we were teammates, because we practiced together, because we have the same philosophy, yeah, I think that's a great idea. And maybe I have somebody on my staff that says, you know, I think he's more comfortable there. I wouldn't move him today. It may cause a problem. It may take him out of his rhythm. You know, maybe I say, I'm not listening to that. I'm going to listen to somebody that I know. I'm going to listen to somebody that's thinking the way I'm thinking. Well, again, it feels like that's trustworthy because it sounds like what I want it to say. But the result that we're talking about is much deeper than losing a baseball game. The result of Rehoboam listening to the wrong counsel was a nation that would be fractured. Look at verses 12 through 16 with me. So Jeroboam and all the people came to Rehoboam the third day, as the king had directed, saying, "Come back to me the third day." The king answered the people roughly and rejected the advice which the elders had given him. And he spoke to them according to the advice of the young men, saying, "My father made your yoke heavy, but I will add to your yoke. My father chastised you with whips, but I will chastise you with scourges." So the king did not listen to the people, for the turn of events was from the Lord, that he might fulfill his word, which the Lord had spoken by Ahijah the Shilonite to Jeroboam the son of Nebat. And when all Israel saw that the king did not listen to them, the people answered the king, saying, "What share have we in David? We have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. To your tents, O Israel. Now see to your own house, O David." Notice that the phrase, "this turn of events was from the Lord." God didn't approve of Rehoboam's arrogance, certainly not. But he allowed Rehoboam to reap the fruit of what he chose. You reap what you sow. So Rehoboam follows the peer advice. The result? 10 tribes walk away, a kingdom splits, and generations to come are negatively affected, all because the king did not listen to the people. He did not listen to the wise counsel. Leadership decisions based on the wrong sources never stay personal. They turn into something that affects a lot more people. You've got to make sure that the decisions that you make are based on the right sources, not on the wrong ones. As we close out, we want to consider once again verse 15, that the king did not listen to the people, and the turn of events was from the Lord. that he might fulfill his word. God sometimes judges leaders by letting them listen to the voices they prefer. In last week's episode, we talked about Joshua 24:15. I want to go back to that for a moment. The people listened to Joshua. They respected him, but he told them, you got to choose for yourselves whom you're going to serve. Are you going to serve God? Are you going to serve the gods of your fathers? Are you going to serve the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell? And the people responded favorably, and they said, we will serve the Lord. We're going to put God first. Well, you know what happened when you read the book of Judges? There arose a generation that knew not the Lord. We're just one generation away from apostasy. We're one generation away from full-blown disobedience to God. And here's the fact. God will allow that to happen. God will allow it to take place. And so you have to make sure that you're making wise decisions based on wise counsel. And so as we close out in the next few minutes, I want us to think about modern application, how we can weather the storm of information overload, how we can weather the storm of making sure we're listening to the right counsel. Number one, leaders today still choose their voices. You choose what you listen to. You choose what you take in as, the source that's going to help you make good decisions, whether that be podcast, threads on Twitter, YouTube teachers, AI summaries, ChatGPT, peer conversations, whatever the case may be. We choose our voices. We need to make sure that we're listening to God, listening to his word, listening to, the example of right here in 1 Kings chapter 12. Why is this example in the Bible? Why is it preserved for us? Well, it's written for our learning, Romans 15:4. It's so we can learn not to follow this example, and we can learn from their mistakes. Number two, peer advice often feels safe. But the problem with that is sometimes it lacks perspective. Many times it lacks accountability. And more often than not, it lacks wisdom. We need to make sure that we're listening to people who've been there and done that. Listening to people who have experience. I mentioned a few moments ago, one of the things I loved about Memphis School of Preaching was sitting at the feet of instructors who they've been in the battlefield. They've preached the gospel. They've been in local work. They've done mission work. And one of the things that didn't hit me until I graduated and left school and started, my own work was, man, these stories they told us, these events that they had, that really happened. And listening to their advice on things, it could be simple things like, somebody passes away. You need to be the first one there at the house to hold the hand of the spouse who just, their husband just died or their wife just died. When somebody's having surgery, be there when the door's open. Stay with them. Have a word of prayer with them before they go back. Be there. Some simple practical things. When you go to visit somebody, don't wear out your welcome. Don't sit on the bed. There's so many of those little things that in the moment I thought, well, yeah, that's important to know, I guess, but what about when you're in the thick of it? What about when you're in the work? What about when you're having to preach that funeral? I'm so thankful for the wisdom and the advice that we received. But what happens if I just listen to people my age, people that don't have a lot of experience? Well, I might get some bad advice. So even though it feels safe, make sure it's coming from the right source and it's going to help you do what's right. And then number three, wisdom often sounds slower. Have you ever thought about that? Wisdom often sounds slower. It's less dramatic. It's less reactive. It's less popular. But wisdom builds stability. I go back to another example. One of my hobbies that I love to do is hunting, deer hunting specifically. I could talk to guys my age or guys that are, only a few years into it, kind of like I am, and they may say, oh, yeah, it don't matter, wear this, wear that. It don't matter if you're in a blind or if you're in a stand. What if I go and listen to somebody that's been hunting for 40, 50 years? And they say something as simple as, hey, You need to be here, this amount of time before daylight, or this amount of time after shooting light. Or, one of the things I heard, in fact, just recently from an experienced hunter was it's just as important how you leave the stand as how you get into the stand. And what he meant by that was, don't blow your cover. If you come in, just walking as loud as you can and making a lot of noise, you're going to run them off. But make sure when you leave that you're also careful about how you do that. So, that's not one of those trendy things. It's less dramatic. But there's stability in that. There's wisdom in that. There's experience in that. And certainly when it comes to spiritual matters, we need to make sure that we listen to sound wisdom. So between now and next week, when we pick back up our study, I want you to ask yourself honestly, who are my counselors? Who am I listening to? And what sources are shaping my decisions that I make? Is it people that, my peers, people I went to school with? Now listen, it could be good advice. That's great. But we need to balance it. We need to weigh it. And ask yourself these follow-up questions. Do my sources ever challenge me? Do they value humility over dominance? Do they help me serve people or control them? If you're listening to this as a leader, you're a coach, a teacher, a preacher, or all the above like I am, we need to make sure that we are practicing these things and making sure that we're seeking good counsel and listening to good counsel. Proverbs 30 and verse 20 says, whoever walks with the wise becomes wise. And let's follow in the steps of those who've been there and done that. Listen to the voice of experience. Rehoboam didn't lose the kingdom in battle. He lost it in the council room. He lost it when he chose to listen to the wrong kind of counsel. And so our future is shaped less by our position and more by our voices. The voices that we listen to, the voices that we seek, the counsel that we seek. So let's make sure that we choose our counsel carefully. And if we'll do that, it will help us to weather the storm of information overload. I thank you so much for listening today. I do hope and pray that you'll continue to be with me this season as we continue this study. And of course, all glory goes to God. Thank you so much. May God bless you.